At O2 Van Zoun, on a night in the autumn of 1942, a boy named Veijo Paine lay on a wooden board laid crosswise over two train seats somewhere on the line between Helsinki and the Swedish border, and he could not get warm. He was a small child, old enough to remember, young enough that everything happening to him was being decided by adults and explained by none of them. Around his neck was a loop of string. On the string, a rectangle of cardboard. On the cardboard, his name, his birth date, his home parish, and a number. He was being moved the way a parcel is moved, labeled so he would arrive somewhere identifiable. The windows of the train car were blacked out, not dim, black, painted or boarded, because the Soviet Air Force targeted rail traffic and a lit train was a target drawn against the snow. Veijo could see nothing of the country going by. He could see the inside of a sealed wooden box that smelled of coal smoke and sick children. And he could feel that he was becoming one of the sick children, and he had no word in any language he owned for what was wrong with him. He was one of 70,000. He did not know that either. 542. Confirmed kills. That was the famous number from this war, one Finnish sniper, 98 days. But this is not that war. This is the other Finland of the Second World War, the one that does not appear in the military histories, the country that decided it could no longer keep its own children and put them on trains and sent them across a border alone. This is not the story of Finland's soldiers. That story is well known. This is the story of what a country does with its children when it has decided it cannot protect them. The committees that organized it, the trains that carried it, the cardboard tags, the families that received the children, and the silence that closed over all of it for almost 50 years. This is the story of roughly 70,000 Finnish children, the great majority sent alone, in the largest movement of unaccompanied children in the history of the Nordic countries. This is the story of a boy who survived the train, was loved by the wrong family, and spent the rest of his life unable to decide who to blame. Veijo Paine was a child of wartime Finland, and the arithmetic of wartime Finland did not balance. In 1939, the country held roughly 3.7 million people. It had a small army, a smaller air force, and an economy of timber and farmland that ran every winter close to the line of what was enough. When the Soviet Union attacked on November 30th, 1939, the war did not stay at the front. It arrived in the cities as bombers. Helsinki was bombed on the first day, and Helsinki, when the bombs came, had shelter space for only a fraction of its people. There was nowhere to put the children when the sirens sounded. There was, steadily, less to feed them in the hours between. The men were at the front. The mothers were left holding everything that remained, and what remained was not enough, and everyone could see that it was not enough. The idea of sending the children away did not come from Finland. It came from Sweden. Sweden was neutral. Sweden had not been invaded, was not being bombed, and had food. In December 1939, in the first weeks of the Winter War, a committee formed in Stockholm with a single purpose: to move Finnish children across the border, to be housed and fed and kept from the war. It went by several names over the years, Centrala Finlandshjälpen among them, and behind it stood the Red Cross, Save the Children, the Salvation Army. On the Finnish side, the transport ran through the Ministry of Social Affairs and the Mannerheim League for Child Welfare. The first transport left almost immediately. On December 15, 1939, 2 weeks after the war began, the first wave of children, mothers, and elderly people sailed from the port of Turku aboard a ship called the Arcturus. The early transports went by sea because the sea route was direct. He wrote in adulthood the truth that the children of 1939 could not yet see, that the people organizing this believed completely that they were performing an act of love. They were. That is the part of this story that resists an easy reading. The sea route changed everything in January 1940, and it changed because of a single event. A boat carrying children was attacked by a Soviet submarine in the Gulf of Bothnia. No children died in the attack, but sailors did, and the lesson was not subtle. When the Soviets began mining the Gulf, the water became something no organizer of children's transport could defend. The traffic moved onto the rails. This is the detail that gave Veijo Payne's journey its shape and the shape of 70,000 others. The children did not, in the main, sail to Sweden. They went by train, north, the entire length of Finland, to the very top of the Gulf of Bothnia, to a Swedish border town called Haparanda, where the Finnish railway met the Swedish one. A rail journey that had been ordinary in peacetime became, in wartime, an ordeal that the children who lived through it would describe 70 years later with a precision that does not blur. The trains ran at night. They ran at night because a train moving in daylight was a dark line against snow, visible from the air for kilometers. So the children traveled in darkness, in cars with the windows blacked out, sealed from the country they were crossing. With military traffic given priority on every line, the journeys stretched, in many documented cases, to 10 days or more. Children slept on boards laid crosswise over the seats. Children slept in the overhead luggage racks because there was no room below. The blackout did not always save them. War children remembered decades later the train stopping, the doors thrown open, the order to run, to get out, to get down among the trees beside the track because Soviet bombers had found the line. The safest arrangement for a trainload of children was to scatter them face down in a forest in the dark. A sealed train full of small children moving for 10 days in winter is not only exhausting, it is a medical event. Disease moved through the transports, diphtheria above all, the illnesses that move through any crowded, unventilated space full of the very young. The figure that comes down through the research is stark. As many as 1 in 5 of the children who left Finland healthy arrived in Sweden sick enough to need a hospital. Some contracted diphtheria on the transfer and did not survive it. And in March 1940, on the line running north toward Haparanda, 2 trains collided. 15 children were killed in that collision, along with several of the mothers and caretakers traveling with them. The transport was meant to carry children away from the thing that kills children. The transport sometimes was the thing. Veijo Paine became one of the 1 in 5. Somewhere on the line he contracted a grave illness, and by the time the train reached the border, he was not a child who could simply be handed to a foster family. He was a patient. He was taken into medical care at Haparanda. And it is from Haparanda, sick in a hospital bed in a country whose language he did not speak, that Veijo did the thing that fixes him in the historical record more firmly than almost any other war child of the tens of thousands. He wrote to his mother. He had no proper paper. So he wrote his letter home on toilet paper, and that letter survived, and it is held now as a facsimile in the published record of the war children. A few lines of a sick boy's handwriting on the only writing surface a quarantine ward would give him, addressed to a woman hundreds of kilometers away who had put him on the train believing it was the protective thing to do. The decision for each individual child had rested with the mother. The fathers, overwhelmingly, were at the front. The mothers were the ones who stayed, who stood in the food queues, who therefore had to weigh the choice. And they did not weigh it in silence. The Finnish authorities wanted the children to go, for the real reasons of food and shelter, but also with an argument made straight at the mothers, that the nation needed them for the reconstruction work, that with the men gone, it was the women who would rebuild, and that a child safe in Sweden was a mother freed to serve. The case was pressed through what can fairly be called a propaganda campaign. Mothers were told what a privilege it was to grow up in Sweden, to eat until full, to sleep without sirens. When newspapers began to criticize the transports, the criticism was censored. The mother who wrote a child's name on a cardboard tag and threaded the string through it was not acting against her society. She was doing the thing her government, her press, and the organized weight of 2 nations' charities all told her was the loving and responsible choice. This is the point that the simple version of the story misses. There is no villain in it. The Swedish families who opened their homes were, by every account, moved by genuine compassion. The committees were not trafficking children, they were trying to save them. The Finnish mothers were not abandoning their children, they were performing what they had been persuaded was an act of protection that demanded more love, not less, because it demanded letting go. And the journey was only the first part. What waited at the other end was the second. And Veijo, because he arrived sick, met the harshest version of it first. A child arriving in Sweden did not step off the train into a warm kitchen. A child arriving in Sweden stepped into a processing system. The children were gathered in halls, hospitals, schools, garrisons. In one documented case, the Hotel Anglais in Stockholm. And they were quarantined, examined, cleaned. The cleaning was not gentle. Clothing was taken away and burned or put into heated chambers to kill lice. Children were bathed and dusted with DDT. They were lined up for medical examinations and vaccinations. Boys and girls, in some accounts, made to stand naked together in line waiting for the needle. There is a detail in the research that should be sat with rather than passed over. Some of the burning of clothes, some of the severity of the delousing was not strictly medically necessary. Part of it was driven by a belief among some Swedes that Finns were dirty. That Finland, by its nearness to Russia, arrived needing to be scrubbed. So a child's clothes, which might have included the last thing his mother's hands had touched, the sweater she had dressed him in on the platform, were sometimes destroyed, not because they were infested, but because of an assumption about where the child came from. The children could not have understood this. They only knew that they had arrived somewhere and that the somewhere had taken their clothes and put them in a fire. For Veijo, it was worse and longer because he was genuinely ill, and the genuinely ill were kept in isolation in Swedish hospitals for weeks, in the hardest cases for months. There is a redemptive thread inside even this. The Swedish hospital care was real care, and by the count of the historians, some 3,000 war children were saved in Swedish hospitals from diseases and from malnutrition. Veijo, in all likelihood, was one of them. The transport nearly killed him. The Swedish ward kept him alive. Both of those things are true, and the story does not work if either is dropped. Then, for the children who were well, came the selection. The children were placed in a room and the foster families came to choose. And here, the accounts of the war children, given decades later, converge on an experience the organizers never designed and perhaps never fully saw. The children understood that they were being picked. They understood that some were chosen first and some last, and some, in the worst version, were left in the emptying room after the others were gone. One woman, recorded under a pseudonym, remembered being the last child left in a large room after every other child had been taken. She remembered the explanation her small mind built from the only evidence it had, that she had not been chosen because she was pale and skinny and ugly. Nobody told her that. The system told her by leaving her until last, and she supplied the rest. She was describing something that the planners of the program had no framework for processing. They had built a system to move children from danger to safety, from hunger to food, from cold to warmth. They had measured the things that could be measured: beds, calories, distance from the bombing. They had not measured what it does to a 4-year-old to stand in a room and be appraised. There was no category in the procurement of safety for the cost of being chosen last. Veijo was eventually placed, and here the story turns, because he was placed with a family that was kind. The Westers. And in the Wester household, Veijo did the thing a young child's mind is built to do. He adapted. He learned Swedish, fast and completely, the way only a small child can. And as the Swedish came in, the Finnish went out. Within a year, the language his mother had spoken to him was a language he no longer had. He attached. He found in the Wester home a father. In his own later words, he called the man Papa Wester, and named him, without hedging, as the only father he had ever known. That sentence is the whole tragedy of the program compressed into 4 words. It was not a failure of the Wester family. Their kindness was real, and Veijo's love for them was earned. It was a 4-year-old's brain working exactly as designed. The system had taken children at precisely the age when attachment is most plastic, removed them from their attachment figures, and placed them for years with new ones. The outcome was not a risk. It was very close to a certainty. The great majority of the children went to foster homes. Sweden had an established tradition of foster care, and the Finnish children, by the historians' count, more than doubled the foster home population of the country during these years. Some went to orphanages, and then the children's individual stories diverged completely, because 70,000 placements are 70,000 different houses. Some children were placed with families who were loving and attentive, and who gave them years they would later describe as among the warmest of their childhoods. There are photographs of war children laughing with foster siblings, looking in the frame like any other child of the 1940s. The Swedish writer Alva Myrdal said the Finnish war children were like a gift from heaven to Sweden, and for some childless Swedish families that is genuinely what the children were, and they were loved as such. But love in a foster home created its own problem, and the problem was structural, and it was the thing the planners did not weigh. And then the war ended, and the children had to come back. The repatriation, by the consensus of the historians who have studied it, was the part handled worst. It had been assumed from the start that the stay would be short, and the return therefore simple. Send the child out, let the danger pass, bring the child home. But the children who came back were not the children who had left. They came back fluent in Swedish and unable to speak Finnish. They came back to mothers they did not recognize, fathers returned from a front they had no memory of, siblings who were strangers, a country that was poor and cold and damaged in a way Sweden had not been. For Veijo, the return was not relief. It was loss, a second one, and in some ways a sharper one than the first, because this time he was old enough to know exactly what was being taken. He was being taken from Papa Wester. In his own account, written in adulthood, he admitted to hateful feelings toward his mother, feelings that intensified after the family left Sweden because he blamed her for taking him away from the Westers, and, in the same breath, felt guilt for all the hardship and anguish she herself had endured. That is the war child's inheritance in a single knot. Rage at the mother for the separation, guilt toward the mother for her suffering, and no way to set either down because the two of them no longer even shared a language to discuss it. For some children, the wrongness of the return was unbearable, and they were sent back to Sweden again. Some crossed that border more than once. One man recorded in the research changed homes 6 times before the age of 10. On the Swedish side, foster families who had raised these children for years sometimes did not want to give them back, and that produced lawsuits. Finnish birth families against Swedish foster families fought across an international border over children who were the only people in the room with no voice in the proceeding. The official count is that more than 15,000 of the children never returned to Finland at all. Some were orphans with nothing to return to. Some were the subject of those custody disputes. Some had simply become, in every functional sense, Swedish, and the paperwork eventually agreed with what the child's life had already decided. Finland's response, as a nation, was silence, and the silence was partly deliberate from the very beginning. As early as the end of January 1942, while the transports were still running, while Veijo was very likely still in Sweden, criticism of the program in the Finnish press was suppressed by the government. Negative coverage was simply no longer permitted. The county governors had been sounding alarms. The governor of Finnish Lapland called the transports from his region a disaster and said plainly that they cost more lives than they saved because the crowded transfers spread tuberculosis and rubella among the children. But the public conversation was closed. After the war, the silence simply continued, no longer enforced, now merely habitual. A thing the country did not discuss because discussing it meant looking at it. For roughly half a century, the war children were, in the phrase that has attached to them, the forgotten ones. The subject was considered too sensitive for serious investigation. It was not until around 1989 that the silence genuinely broke, and the war children, by then in their 50s and 60s, began to be asked what had happened to them. What they said and what the research that followed found is the hardest part of the story, because it inverts the entire premise. The premise had been protection. The children were sent away to be safer, and the long-term studies, including work drawing on the Helsinki birth cohort, a body of data large enough and long enough to actually measure such things, found that the children who were sent away did worse on average than the children who stayed in Finland through the bombing. Not in every case. Thousands of war children built good and full lives, and many said in old age that they believed the evacuation had, for them, been a positive thing. The participants in one study of war children's lifelong reflections wrote with an optimistic tone, with gratitude and pride at having fared so well. But in the aggregate, measured across the population, the evacuees carried more. A higher incidence of mental health difficulties, particularly, the research noted, around personality disorders and substance abuse. Elevated physical risks that reached into heart disease and diabetes, consistent with what is now understood about severe early childhood stress leaving its mark on the body itself. And in one of the most sobering findings, the difficulty did not stop with the war children. A study found elevated rates of depression in the daughters of the female war children. The stress had not stayed inside the person who was separated. It had passed down. 2 generations of women, one of whom never rode a train at all, carried the cost of a decision made under pressure years before. The children who stayed in Finland stayed in a country at war. They were bombed, they were hungry, they were frightened, and on average they came through it better than the children who were saved from it, because what they kept through all of it was their mothers. The thing the protection program removed turned out to be the thing that did the protecting. This was the quiet catastrophe of the War Child program, and it was not designed as a catastrophe. It was designed as rescue. Finland could not feed and shelter every child under its bombers. Finland reached for the only help on offer, and the help was real, and the people who extended it were sincere. The destruction of tens of thousands of attachments was a consequence of a system built for survival, not a deliberate cruelty. But the effect was the same. This is not a comfortable conclusion, and it should not be smoothed into one. It is not a verdict on the mothers who chose under pressure, with bad information, in real fear, told by every authority around them that letting go was the loving choice. It is not a verdict on Sweden, which acted out of genuine generosity and did, demonstrably, save children. The 3,000 pulled back from disease and starvation in Swedish wards were saved in the plainest sense of the word, and Veijo Payne was very likely among them. The conclusion is something more uncomfortable than villainy. It is that a vast machinery of sincere goodwill, built and run by competent and compassionate people across 2 nations, can produce a deep and lasting harm when it rests on a single wrong assumption about what a child most needs. The planners assumed the child most needed safety, food, and shelter. The evidence gathered over the 70 years that followed suggests the child most needed the specific, irreplaceable adult who had been there from the beginning, and that food, shelter, and the absence of bombs, real as those goods are, did not stand in for her. Veijo Paine survived the Winter War transports and the Continuation War transports and was returned to Finland, which was not guaranteed for every child. He did not vanish into the 15,000 who never came back. He grew up and he grew old, and like many war children, he eventually wrote his way back from his own bomb, set the story down on paper, the way he had once set a letter down on toilet paper in a quarantine ward in Haparanda. The honesty of what he wrote is its value. he did not resolve the knot. He held, at once and to the end, his love for Papa Wester, his anger at the mother who sent him, and his guilt for her suffering. He did not pretend the three could be reconciled. He simply reported that they coexisted, because that was the truth, and the truth was the only thing the program had left fully in his possession. His mother had written a cardboard tag once, with his name on it and a number, so that he would not be lost. And on paper, he never was. The Finnish Ministry of Social Affairs, to its lasting credit, kept a record of every single child, every kantakortti, every travel document, so that no child was lost in the files. He did not know, as a child on that train, that the tag around his neck would do its job, and the thing he actually needed would not survive the journey. He had assumed, the way a child assumes, that being sent somewhere meant being sent towards something. What he learned instead, what tens of thousands of war children learned in the years it took the research to catch up to them, is the specific knowledge that protection and presence are not the same thing, and that a society can be persuaded to trade the second for the first. This knowledge, once acquired, is not discarded when the war ends. It remains. The tag did its work. It carried his name across a border. It could not carry the one thing he needed across with him, because that thing could not be written on a card and could not be sent ahead on a train. It could only be held onto. And the entire apparatus of two well-meaning nations had been built, without ever intending it, to make holding on the single thing his mother was not allowed to do. The lessons of the war child transports were studied, eventually, by psychologists and social scientists across the Nordic countries and beyond. They noted the disease that moved through the sealed trains. They noted the failure of the repatriation planning. They noted the custody lawsuits and the lost language and the 15,000 who never came home. What they understood, finally, was the conclusion the planners of 1939 had not been able to see, that a smaller, quieter need, a child's need for one constant person, could be overridden by a larger, louder one, and that overriding it would impose costs that ran for 2 generations. This lesson existed in the War Child program from the first transport. It simply took 50 years of silence and then 30 years of research before anyone was permitted to say it plainly. The war children are old now, or they are gone. The youngest were toddlers in 1944. They are in their 80s or older. Most of the ones who rode the blacked-out trains north through the dark are no longer alive to describe it. Veijo Paine wrote his account, and his account survived him, the way the letter on toilet paper survived the quarantine ward. It sits now in the published record of the war children. It is the testimony of a man who was carried into safety and spent his life trying to understand what safety had cost him. His mother had written his name twice, perhaps. Many of them did, wanting the card to look neat, wanting the child to look cared for when he arrived. She had controlled the one thing she could control that morning, the tag. And it had not been enough. She had been told it was love. It was love. They were exactly sincere. They were sincere people who could not see, yet, what the child most needed. And that, not cruelty, not indifference, but sincerity acting on a wrong assumption, was enough to mark a generation. If this story stayed with you, like and subscribe. We find these forgotten stories every single week. Veijo Paine carried love for the family that raised him and anger at the mother who sent him away and could never fully reconcile the two. So drop a comment and tell us. If you had been that child, do you believe you could ever have forgiven the parent who put you on that train, knowing she believed she was saving you? And watch this next video. It is another story history almost let disappear.